Imagine, for a moment, America right after the Civil War, say 1865. Forget your smartphone, your car, your instant communication.
It's hard to picture, really.
Yeah, try to picture cities with unpaved, unsewered streets, maybe some flickering gas lights, and all transport powered by horses, most wealth,
Ah,
tied up in land or, simple trade.
a completely different world.
Now, contrast that with today. Skyscrapers, instant global communication, high-speed travel, food everywhere. That huge transformation happening in barely 50 years. That's what we're plunging into today.
It really was a seismic shift, and this deep dive is all about that age of big business, how a nation of farmers and, well, small-scale artisans basically became an industrial powerhouse.
Right.
We're going to explore the key inventions, the resources they found, and maybe especially these larger-than-life figures, the captains of industry, as they were called. Some visionary, some, well, pretty ruthless.
And their actions, whether you realize it or not, good or bad, they directly shape the conveniences, maybe some of the challenges you face every single day.
Absolutely.
And to explore this, we're drawing from a really fascinating source. The Age of Big Business, a chronicle of the captains of industry by Burton J. Hendrick, published back in 1919.
Which gives it this incredible, almost contemporary perspective on the whole thing. It was written relatively close to the events.
Exactly. So let's get into it. To really understand how massive this change was, you first have to grasp just how different America looked in 1865.
Yeah, the source paints a picture that's almost unrecognizable. No transcontinental railroads yet. No telephones, no electric lights.
Right.
The railroads they did have. Fragile, unheated, lit by dim kerosene lamps. Cities relied on these slow, horse-drawn streetcars. It was, simpler, but much less connected, much less comfortable.
And even the language of business itself was still forming. Our source points out that terms we use all the time now, like trust, restraint of trade, interlocking directorates, holding companies, they just didn't exist or wouldn't have made sense to business leaders back then.
That really tells you something, doesn't it, about the new economic structures that were just starting to emerge.
Totally.
And fortune itself. It was on a completely different scale. Before the war, wealth usually came from land, maybe what the source calls humdrum trade. Millionaires were incredibly rare.
Like how rare?
Well, get this, an 1855 pamphlet listed only 19 people in New York City worth over $1 million. The richest, William B. Astor, at $6 million.
$6 million. Seems like a lot, but compared to later.
Exactly. Even Cornelius Vanderbilt, who we'll talk about, was listed then at maybe $1.5 million from shipping. Fortunes were made in things like glue manufacturing or dry goods. They were called merchant princes, not captains of industry. The sheer scale was about to explode.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a bit counterintuitive. You'd think a huge bloody conflict like the Civil War would just wreck an economy.
Yeah, you'd absolutely expect that. Long wars usually mean exhaustion.
But our source argues the opposite happened. The Civil War actually acted as this powerful catalyst, kick-starting America's industries, especially in the North and West.
It's a fascinating paradox. The sheer need to feed and equip armies of millions created this unprecedented demand. It reshaped entire industries almost overnight.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the Mississippi River was closed off by the Confederacy, so all the Western farm products suddenly had to go east by rail.
Ah, okay.
And that led to the rapid growth of these huge trunk lines, and it basically made Chicago a major shipping hub, almost out of nowhere.
And manufacturing too, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. The demand for uniforms. It completely revolutionized the woolen mills, need boots for millions of soldiers. That laid the groundwork for America's huge shoe industry, boosted by new tech like the McKay sewing machine.
And feeding the armies.
Built the great packing plants. It touched everything.
What about farming itself? Weren't millions of men off fighting?
That's where technology stepped in. The McCormick Reaper. It wasn't brand new, but the war made it indispensable. Our source says a single reaper, maybe run by a young boy or girl, could cut a dozen acres of grain in a day.
Wow. So one person could do the work of many.
Exactly. It meant millions could fight, but the farms stayed productive. They even exported surplus grain to Europe, which, believe it or not, helped finance the Union War effort. Foreign observers were apparently astonished by this.
So the war ends. What happens next? Does everything slow down?
Quite the opposite. The post-war period saw this huge influx of capital and labor. The fact that the U.S. government spent, what, over $1 million a day during the war and then started paying off its debt rapidly?
That must have built confidence.
Enormous confidence. Foreign investors poured money in. And at the same time, you had unprecedented immigration from Europe. So you had the money and the people needed for massive industrial growth.
And the soldiers coming home. Over 1 million of them.
Yeah, European critics apparently predicted chaos, social unrest, but the source says these returning soldiers mostly became pioneers. They headed west, opened new mines, started farms, especially out in the Trans-Mississippi region, or into the new oil fields in Pennsylvania. They became this dynamic force for expansion, not trouble.
So this dynamic era needed dynamic leaders, right? And that brings us to figures like Cornelius Vanderbilt. You picture him as maybe an old shipping magnate. But the source says his real work, the big railroad stuff, started when he was past 70.
It's incredible, isn't it? In 1865, his fortune was maybe $10 million. 12 years later, when he died in 1877, $104 million.
Whoa, a tenfold increase in just over a decade.
That shows you how fast things were changing and how guys like him could capitalize. He was apparently quite a character, imposing, uneducated, fiery temper, and weirdly relied heavily on spiritualists for business advice.
And that famous quote about the law. What do I care about law? He and I got the power.
Yeah, that sort of sums up the attitude of the era, doesn't it? Raw, unchecked ambition. But think about what he did. Before him, a trip from New York to Chicago meant changing trains 17 times.
17 times. That's insane.
A nightmare for people and goods. Vanderbilt saw the chaos and imposed order. He bought up these disconnected lines, the Hudson River, New York Central, Lake Shore, and merged them into one single, smoothly operating system.
And that made a real difference.
Huge difference. Cut travel time from New York to Chicago from 50 hours down to 24. He ripped out old iron rails, put in steel, laid 4 tracks on key routes, built steel bridges, bought powerful new locomotives. Yes, he was ruthless, engaged in stock watering, inflating stock values, but you can't deny he built essential, efficient infrastructure the country desperately needed.
Okay, so Vanderbilt's connecting the country with rails.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, another revolution is literally bubbling up from the ground. Oil.
Right. Petroleum. It had been known for centuries, but mostly just used for, like, greasing wagon axles or in patent medicines, Seneca oil, things like that. Nobody really knew the potential. Until 1859, E.L. Drake drills a well in western Pennsylvania. And it wasn't just a lucky guess. It was driven by this guy, George H. Bissell, who had this vision of oil as a lighting source. And crucially, a Yale professor, Benjamin Silliman Jr., analyzed it and confirmed it could be refined cheaply into great light.
But people thought Drake was crazy at first.
Totally. The source says the locals in Titusville thought he was a lunatic drilling for oil. But when Drake's folly struck oil, that whole region just exploded.
Like a gold rush.
Exactly like the California gold rush. Instant fortunes made and lost. Gushers were common. Towns popped up overnight. Early pipelines started appearing. It transformed that whole area.
And out of this chaos emerges John D. Rockefeller.
Yes. He starts as this meticulous bookkeeper in Cleveland, very focused on thrift. Enters the refining business young, around 23, with decent capital. But what set him apart was his vision, his ambition.
What was the vision?
Before he was even 30, Rockefeller apparently decided he would monopolize the entire oil industry. He saw millions needing this product and thought, basically, all of it shall be mine.
That sounds audacious.
Completely. Unprecedented in America at the time, more like something you'd see with old European monarchies granting monopolies.
And he built the Standard Oil machine to do it.
Incredible speed and efficiency. Starting around 1870, Standard Oil of Ohio just swallowed competitors. They weren't just refining, they bought terminals, marketing companies, and crucially, the pipelines. They even bought out rivals building long-distance pipelines. Control the flow, control the industry?
How did they succeed so fast? Just better business.
Well, partly yes. The source credits supreme business intelligence, cutting out middlemen, having lots of capital, smart refinery placement, research into byproducts. But there was another side, the railroad rebates.
Ah, the infamous rebates. How did that work?
It was pretty scandalous, especially the South Improvement Company scheme. Basically, railroads secretly agreed to raise shipping rates for everyone, but then give Standard Oil huge rebates back.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. They'd even give Standard rebates on their competitors' shipments.
Wait, they got paid when their rivals shipped oil.
Exactly. It made it impossible for independents to compete. Standard could sell oil for less than it cost rivals just to ship theirs. Public outrage eventually killed that specific scheme by law, but by then, Standard had already forced most Cleveland refiners to sell out, often by just showing them the secret rebate contracts.
And this is where the trust comes in.
Yes, another innovation, though a controversial one, the Standard Oil Trust of 1882. It was a legal workaround. Shareholders of supposedly competing companies turned their stock over to a board of trustees.
Who then ran everything as one giant entity.
Precisely. It allowed centralized control across state lines, dodging anti-monopoly laws of the time. It was secretive, powerful, and it introduced the word trust as a major political issue.
But it didn't last forever.
No. The courts eventually caught up. Ohio ordered it dissolved in 1892, and the big one was 1911. The U.S. Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil of New Jersey under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, in practice, the same few people often still controlled the smaller companies that resulted, but it was a landmark moment.
And by the 1890s, were they still a total monopoly anyway?
Not quite total. New oil fields were found outside Pennsylvania, in places like Texas. New competitors rose up, like Pure Oil, Gulf, Texas Refining, and the rebate system was eventually dismantled. So Standard was still huge, immensely powerful financially, but not the absolute chokehold it once was.
Okay, so oil is fueling things, but another industry is literally building the country's framework, steel.
Absolutely. America went from being a wood country to a steel country incredibly fast. In 1865, steel was rare, expensive. By 1914, the U.S. produced more steel than the entire United Kingdom. It changed everything: railroads, buildings, bridges, eventually cars, farm equipment.
What made that possible?
The key was the Bessemer process. It was actually discovered independently by an American, William Kelly, and an Englishman, Henry Bessemer. The breakthrough was realizing you could blow ordinary air through molten pig iron.
Just air.
Just air. It generated intense heat, burned off impurities like carbon, and turned iron into steel cheaply. Not by the pound, but by the ton. That was the revolution.
And you needed the raw materials.
And America had them in unbelievable abundance. The discovery of these mountains of iron in Minnesota's Lake Superior region, especially the Mesaba Range, it was game-changing. You could literally scoop up high-grade iron ore from the surface with steam shovels. Incredibly cheap.
So cheap process, cheap materials, and the right people.
Exactly. The men of steel. Andrew Carnegie is the most famous. Scottish immigrant, started as a bobbin boy. His genius wasn't really in the technical side of steelmaking, but as a salesman, a commercial traveler, and a motivator.
Didn't he have a saying about surrounding himself with smart people?
Yeah, his suggested epitaph. Here lies the man who knew how to get around him, men who were cleverer than himself. He drove his teams hard, though. Famously wired a superintendent who reported breaking production records. Congratulations, why not do it every week?
Relentless.
He needed good partners. Henry Phipps, a childhood friend, handled the finances, the details, and Henry C. Frick, the coke king. Coke from coal was essential for steelmaking, and Frick controlled the best source in Connellsville.
So Carnegie's genius was putting it all together.
Yes, creating this integrated empire. They owned everything. The coal mines, the limestone quarries, the iron ore mines in Minnesota, the ships to transport the ore, the railroads to carry it, and finally the mills to make the steel. Vertical integration. Cut out middlemen, controlled costs.
And did they get those railroad rebates too, like Standard Oil?
Oh, yes. The source points out that Carnegie's fortune also got an artificial stimulation from rebates. He was very shrewd in making deals, like naming his first big plant after the Pennsylvania Railroad president and making him a partner.
So how did this era of Carnegie's dominance end?
It ended with the birth of U.S. Steel. Carnegie was actually planning to retire. But then these new Wall Street-backed steel trusts started forming, competing with him. Morgan's National Tube Company, for instance.
Well, he jumped back in.
He did. He announced plans for a massive new cutting-edge plant that would have seriously undercut the competition. It basically forced J.P. Morgan's hand. Morgan had to buy Carnegie out to stabilize the industry, or rather to consolidate his own control.
And that was the U.S. Steel deal.
The huge one. Morgan paid Carnegie around $492 million in 1901, an absolutely staggering sum then. This created the United States Steel Corporation, the world's largest corporation at the time. It really marked the end of the individual titans dominating industry and the beginning of massive corporate control.
From steel beams to telephone wires. Let's talk about connecting the nation's voices. The telephone had a rocky start, didn't it?
It really did. The London Times famously called it the latest American humbug in 1877. Just a toy.
But that changed quickly.
Dramatically. Just a few decades later, another English traveler called it America's most poetical achievement. And remember Emperor Dom Pedro of Brazil at the Philadelphia Expo in 1876? First time he heard it, he apparently cried out, "My God, it talks."
And Americans really took to it.
Like no other nation, the stats are kind of mind-blowing. By 1917, the U.S. had something like 75% of all the world's telephones. 10 million here versus maybe 4 million in the rest of the world combined.
Wow. Why such a difference?
The source suggests Americans just developed this sixth sense for remote communication. We used it for everything: business, socializing, emergencies. It broke down isolation, especially in rural areas. It became a huge civilizing force.
And the inventor, Alexander Graham Bell, he wasn't an electrician.
No, fascinatingly, he was a teacher of the deaf. His expertise was in sound and acoustics. He apparently said he might not have invented it if he'd known more about electricity. He was studying how sound worked, even examined a dead man's ear.
And the breakthrough moment.
Dramatic. 1876. He was experimenting, heard this twang from a transmitter wire Watson had plucked, and realized the sound had carried electrically. Then came those first famous words. "Come here, Watson, I want you."
But the first phones weren't great, were they?
Oh, apparently they were awful. The source calls them torture to use. You had to shout into them, and the lines had all this static, moaning, shriekings, mutterings from using the ground for the circuit return.
So it needed improving.
Lots of improvement, many unsung heroes here. Edison developed a better transmitter early on. Others created better instruments, better switchboards. A key step was the metallic circuit, using 2 wires instead of 1 wire, and the ground, which got rid of most of the noise. That was John J. Carty.
Making it work over long distances, that was a big hurdle.
Huge. Wires had to be incredibly thick and expensive. The solution came from Michael Pupin, an immigrant from Serbia, a Columbia professor, a really romantic story. He figured out how to load the lines with induction coils at specific intervals.
The Pupin coil.
Exactly. It let them use much thinner, cheaper wires for long distance. And it even enabled the phantom circuit, sending multiple phone and telegraph messages over just 2 pairs of wires. Pure genius.
But who turned this invention into a massive business?
That was Theodore N. Vail. He was recruited from the Railway Mail Service, which was known for its efficiency. Bell and Watson were initially doing these, vaudeville demonstrations to raise money.
Right.
Vail had a much bigger vision, not just tolls from a gadget, but one system, one policy, universal service. He saw the telephone as a tool to, as he put it, spread American civilization.
Did he face challenges?
Immediately, the giant Western Union Telegraph Company. First, they dismissed the phone. Then they realized its potential and tried to crush Bell by promoting rival inventors and using Edison's superior transmitter, which they controlled initially.
A classic big versus little fight.
It was a real corporation war. But Vail didn't back down. He sued Western Union. It was bold. And surprisingly, Western Union eventually settled, acknowledging Bell's patents and getting out of the phone business. That ensured the Bell system's survival and future growth.
And the source notes something unusual about the phone company compared to others.
Yeah, it's quite striking. It highlights the telephone company's unusually clean record for the era. They apparently steadily decreased prices over time, didn't issue watered stock, inflated shares, and generally showed a high sense of public responsibility, a real contrast to some of the other stories.
Interesting. Okay, so we've connected the country with rails and wires. What about powering the cities themselves? That also changed dramatically.
Oh, completely. Think about cities in the 1870s. Very few gas lamps, mostly dim and flickering. Transportation was these primitive horse car lines. And get this, often, each avenue or major street had its own independent company, meaning you had to pay a new fare every time you transferred lines. Rides were awful bumpy, crowded, often with straw on the floor in winter, supposedly for warmth.
Ugh.
Then came electricity.
Exactly. 2 key inventions changed everything. Thomas Edison's incandescent light bulb and Frank Sprague's development of the first practical electric trolley system, which he demonstrated in Richmond, Virginia in 1887.
And this created opportunities for consolidation.
Big time. Powerful financial syndicates emerged. Names like Yerkes, Widener, Elkins, Dolan, Whitney, Ryan. These groups swooped in, bought up all the small, fragmented horse car lines and gaslight companies, electrified them, merged them into unified systems, and issued massive amounts of stocks and bonds on these new consolidated companies.
So on one hand, the public got better services.
Absolutely. Huge public benefit. Cheap, comfortable, fast electric trolleys that let cities expand outwards. Bright, affordable electric lighting. It really modernized urban life.
There's always a but, isn't there? There's a pretty shameful other side to this story, as the source puts it, because these new public utility companies needed franchises the right to use public streets for their tracks and wires.
And how did they get those rights?
Well, the easiest way, apparently, was to control city governments. Bribery and corruption became deeply intertwined with the development of public utilities. Politics became just another part of the business.
Any notorious examples?
Plenty. Charles T. Yerkes, who actually served time for embezzlement earlier in his career, famously said about his Chicago streetcar system, "It is the strap hanger who pays the dividends." He later unloaded his overinflated system onto a New York syndicate.
And the infamous Boodle Alderman in New York.
A classic case. Jacob Sharp wanted a franchise for a horse car line on Broadway, hugely valuable. He apparently bribed the New York City alderman with $500,000 in cash.
$500,000 back then.
A fortune. These aldermen were suddenly sporting diamonds buying real estate. Then many of them fled the country when the investigation started.
Who was behind the investigation?
Well, the source suggests Sharp's rivals, the syndicate, including William C. Whitney and Thomas F. Ryan, might have quietly pushed for it. Sharp's downfall conveniently cleared the path for their syndicate to eventually acquire that same valuable Broadway franchise.
So Whitney and Ryan, tell me about them.
Whitney was fascinating, brilliant Yale graduate, protege of reform Governor Samuel Tilden, even served as Secretary of the Navy and modernized it. But later in life, he became this luxury-loving financier, deeply involved in Tammany Hall politics to advance his utility ventures. Ryan was different, described as adroit, suave, and noiseless, immensely industrious, very secretive.
And they formed the Metropolitan Traction Company.
Yes, which the source identifies as the first major holding company in the U.S., a company whose main business was owning stock in other companies. It was a new way to consolidate control, supposedly invented by their lawyer, Francis Lynn Stetson, who Ryan joked made them a great big tin box to hold shares.
And how do they operate this holding company?
Well, according to the source, it involved massively inflating values. They'd acquire properties or franchises, maybe through political connections, then sell them to their own holding company, the Metropolitan, for vastly more in stock. Like, a construction project costing $500,000 might be turned over for $6 million in stock.
Wow, pure paper profits.
And the construction accounts themselves were apparently mysterious and incredible. Millions just vanished. When investigators later tried to examine the books, key records had been destroyed, literally sold to a junk man for $117.
Unbelievable. How to keep investors interested?
They paid high dividends, 7% on Metropolitan stock. But here's the catch. They often paid these dividends with borrowed money just to make the stock seem valuable and attractive to the public.
House of cards.
Totally. The public bought in, pushing the stock price up to $269 a share at one point. Meanwhile, insiders like Whitney quietly sold their shares. Eventually, the whole thing collapsed. In 1907, the Metropolitan confessed it was insolvent, a wrecked and plundered shell.
Did things change after that?
Yes, thankfully. These kinds of extreme abuses led to public outrage and significant political reforms. States started creating public utility commissions to regulate franchises, rates, and stock issuance. The source concludes that the era of the unchecked Metropolitan Syndicate was over. Those specific operations couldn't be repeated.
Okay, so cities are being transformed. What about the farms? That was still the backbone of the country.
And it underwent its own revolution, maybe quieter, but just as profound.
Yeah.
Think about agriculture before the Civil War. It was ancient. Farmers used sickles, scythes. Methods hadn't changed much in millennia.
Right.
Post-war, the American farm became, as the source describes it, a huge factory. Machinery started doing almost everything.
We talked about the McCormick Reaper during the war.
And its impact just kept growing. Remember, it let one person do the work of many, freeing up labor and boosting production massively. It helped the North fight and get richer.
Did the Reaper itself get better?
Continuously. McCormick's original 1831 machine just cut the grain. Then came machines where men could stand on a platform and bind the sheaves. Then came wire binders, which weren't ideal. The big breakthrough was John Appleby's twine binder in 1884. That became the global standard. It cut the grain and automatically tied it into bundles with twine.
And Cyrus McCormick, the inventor, was
Mhm.
he also a good businessman?
A brilliant one, and apparently fiercely competitive. The source says he had this almost religious conviction that the entire harvester business belonged to him.
Even with rivals?
Oh, there was tons of competition, thousands of patents, hundreds of companies. But McCormick was smart. He moved his factory to Chicago early on in 1847, right near the booming western prairies. He pioneered installment plans, letting farmers buy expensive machines and pay over time from their harvests. This, along with things like the Homestead Act, really opened up the West.
And they have these field contests.
Yeah, the source describes this Homeric struggle. Rival harvester agents would hold these dramatic public competitions out in the fields, trying to prove whose machine was faster, better, more reliable. It was marketing and R&D combined, pushing innovation westward.
What was the overall impact of all this farm machinery?
Globally significant. It made American and Canadian farms the most efficient in the world, not necessarily the most yield per acre, but the most output per worker. It helped banish the specter of famine in industrialized nations and made America known everywhere as the place from which the reapers come.
But all that competition, was it sustainable?
Apparently not. It became brutal. Cutthroat pricing was hurting everyone. Eventually, it forced the biggest rivals, McCormick, Deering, and others, into an uneasy merger.
How did that happen?
It took J.P. Morgan's finance wizard, George Perkins. The source has this great anecdote. Perkins had to negotiate by keeping the four main company heads in separate rooms because they disliked each other so much. Putting them together would have killed the deal.
Wow.
But it worked. They formed the International Harvester Company, which controlled about 85% of the U.S. farm machinery market. Another example of consolidation ending an era of fierce individual competition.
Okay, one last giant industry that basically came out of nowhere. Automobiles.
Astonishing, isn't it? An industry that barely existed 15 years earlier became one of America's $3 billion industries by 1917. We went from making maybe 3,700 vehicles in 1899 to 1.5 million in 1916.
An unforeseen giant, and the key figure here is Henry Ford.
A completely different kind of industrial leader, not a financier like Morgan or Rockefeller, not focused on Wall Street. He was a puttering mechanic, as the source calls him, obsessed with manufacturing efficiency. By 1917, he was possibly richer than Rockefeller, but his beginnings were just a small shed factory.
What was his big idea?
Standardization. He apparently got the idea as a boy watching how watches were made with interchangeable parts. It wasn't entirely new bicycles, locomotives used some standardization, but Ford took it to a whole new level with the automobile.
Is that the story about taking cars apart in England?
Yes. A famous demonstration. He had 3 Ford cars disassembled, all the parts mixed into a pile. Then mechanics reassembled 3 perfectly working cars using parts randomly drawn from the pile. That blew the minds of European manufacturers who built cars more like individual crafts. That, the source says, showed the power of American standardization.
And Ford had a vision for who should own cars.
A radical vision for the time. He saw the car not as a luxury toy for the rich, but as a convenience for ordinary people. His goal was for every family to own one. People laughed at him initially.
How did he plan to achieve that?
Through the ultimate expression of his philosophy. The source paints this picture. No skilled fitting required on the line itself. Pre-assembled units, engines, frames, wheels arrive precisely when needed. The chassis moves down the line, workers add specific parts in a perfectly timed sequence, until at the end, a finished car drives off under its own power.
And they made thousands a day like this.
Yeah, something like 2,000 cars a day by the time the source was written. Unprecedented efficiency.
So Ford represents something different.
This source definitely presents him that way. Contrasts his spirit of service, sharing profits with workers via high wages, avoiding speculation, constantly lowering prices for the consumer with the more raw, ego-driven ambition of someone like Vanderbilt. Ford, in this view, represents the full flower of American manufacturing genius and maybe a shift towards somewhat higher ideals in industry.
So wrapping this up, we've covered a lot. This deep dive really shows how America transformed itself at this incredible, almost unimaginable speed, barely 50 years.
Yeah, it's a story powered by, well, incredible natural resources, these groundbreaking inventions we talked about, and these really remarkable individuals, brilliant, driven, but also sometimes ethically questionable, maybe.
Definitely. And these dives into oil, steel, telephones, utilities, farm machines, cars, they really did build the foundation of modern American life, didn't they? And its global economic power. The conveniences you rely on today trace right back to this era.
No question about it.
The source material we used, Hendrick's book, It praises the inventive skill and the business capacity, but it's also pretty blunt about the ruthlessness, the corruption, the disregard of private rights that often went hand in hand with all this progress.
It doesn't shy away from that darker side.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Looking at the incredible convenience and accessibility we have today, your phone, your car, your lights, how much of that original, maybe uncomfortable ruthlessness do you think was sort of an unavoidable cost of getting here? Of achieving our modern standard of living? And maybe more importantly, what, if anything, has really changed in how big business operates today to balance that drive for profit with ensuring public benefit?